had invented the idea of the rapid selector. The rapid selector machine was intended for information retrieval, for retrieval of information which was held on rolls of microfilm. The notion was that it would scan through rolls of microfilm until coded symbols, coded areas, an index, if you like, on each frame of the film sorry, I'm not saying this very well. As it scanned the film, it checked the, so to speak, the index codes, and it would stop when it found one that was relevant. That was apparently something he had started working on before the war. After the war, he had suggested the idea of a personal information retrieval system, his Memex project. His autobiography, Pieces of the Action, indicated that the Rapid Selector project hadn't just launched to an end when the people involved had got involved in wartime activities. Rather, that project had gone into the wartime activities and had been the basis of work done by US cryptanalytic agencies. His biography said nothing about the Rapid Arithmetical Machine project, which dated from almost exactly the same time. The Rapid Arithmetical Machine project, he seems to have started almost immediately after that survey paper. So it's work that was done by somebody before the war in full and conscious knowledge of Babbage's analytical machine. He, perhaps with colleagues, wrote a number of memoranda, and those memoranda are ones that I still cannot find. Two people were employed on the project in succession. Their names were Overbeck and Radford. I forget which in which order. The first year or so of the project was concerned with designing adders and multipliers and registers and so on. The second year of the project went off into the design of special electronic tubes in order to try and reduce the number of tubes that would be needed. As far as I know, the project received sponsorship, I think, from National Cash Register and Eastman Kodak. Again, my memory may be at fault there. The ENIAC patent litigation between Honeywell and Univac caused a number of reports from this Rapid Arithmetical Machine project to be rediscovered. Reports by Radford, for example, and Overbeck, for example, but not the original memoranda. So only reports dating from about 1938 onwards. None of the people who were involved in that testified in the trial. In a certain sense, there was no special pleading on the behalf of the MIT work of the relevance of that to the ENIAC invention. So it wasn't mentioned at all in the summaries of the patent that were the summary of the prehistory that became the official record of the trial. Where are we? I still cannot find Vannevar Bush's early memos. However, the latest edition of my book reprints a 1940 memo that he wrote summarizing where the project had got to there. And it was clear that at that stage the ideas of program control were fairly rudimentary, but nevertheless it clearly was intended to be a completely automatic, program-controlled digital computer. As such, the earliest written such proposal that I know in the world, hence the efforts that I and Professor Wiles and others have put into trying to find these memos. Why Vannevar Bush explicitly in his post-war biography claimed he had nothing to do with the invention of the computer, I just do not know and understand. The one link, the one quite positive, though perhaps tenuous link from that pre-war, that work that went on till about 1942 before it was, as far as we can tell, completely abandoned. The one link between that and the post-war computer seems to be Perry Crawford. Perry Crawford was a student at MIT. He wrote a couple of dissertations at the BSc and the MSc level, each of which clearly was, and explicitly was written against a background of these memoranda. The BSc dissertation was about the design of a special machine for doing matrix algebra. The MSc one was on the design of a fire control machine. Crawford was the person who is credited by Eckert and Mauchly with having provided them with a technology for what we now call a read-only memory, and also giving them the idea of a magnetic disk. And it was Eckert and Mauchly at least claim that the origins of the stored program computer concept go back to their ideas for a magnetic calculating machine.
Now, would Van Bush have known about Asinoff in Iowa?
That I have no idea.
Would
it is quite possible.
Known about Van Bush? Didn't Bush have...
I would have guessed that Atanasoff would know about him. Atanasoff is still alive. One of the things one might do is ask him. Oh yes, Atanasoff is still alive.
Why hasn't anybody interviewed him?
Atanasoff has been interviewed quite a few times now.
He has?
And I believe... there is, in the last but one issue of the Annals...
We have a good hour left.
Okay. It sounded like a tape ending.
Well, I just pushed the button.
Oh, I see. Okay.
This is going to go off in about 2 minutes, so I'll just let you down. Okay, did he testify at the Honeywell trial?
Atanasoff very much testified at the Honeywell trial. So he was very much involved there, but links to Vannevar Bush, as I say, weren't explored. There's recently been an article by Art Birks, which goes into very great detail about the ENIAC and Atanasoff.
That was in, I just read that. That was in
the Annals of History of Computing. Okay. And I understand that Atanasoff himself has agreed to write down his
we must
his
have
reflections.
Come to our seminar. I mean, to our panel. See, now I'm exploring the way to structure that World War II. The concepts from your point of view, from what you've done in the way of research and history, as well as your knowledge of computer science, you see any trends that took place during that era in terms of simultaneous inventions, an ideal time finally came, perhaps? Was there a cause-effect or just synchronistic activities? What's worth bringing out if we had a seminar?
Well, it seems very clear to me that World War II was a great forcer of technology. That's an obvious point to make, but it's still very, very true. That I think if World War II had happened 10 years earlier, you might even have said the computer might have happened 10 years earlier. That's perhaps an exaggeration. I, for one, however, believe that Torres y Quevedo, the Spaniard, if he had been in an environment which had had the sort of pressure and money that that say Mauchly had, then he undoubtedly could have produced at least a computer to match the sort of thing that Stibitz did. Perhaps time was not, you couldn't go quite that early with respect to electronics. Perhaps you could. Certainly, Tommy Flowers, looking at the papers from the Rapid Arithmetical Machine Project, the papers dating from about 39 and 40, was saying, yes, from his viewpoint, MIT was then in a position to build something.
This is looking after the fact. He did not know about the MIT.
He didn't know after the fact.
Yes, I talked to him when he was here last year. Yeah. It's strange that the British Post Office, the British Post Office electrical engineers, had not been following some of the things happening here.
They had quite good links with Bell Labs.
But
all the work that they had been doing had been in the area of telephone exchanges. And it's only with hindsight can you realize that two apparently separate subjects are in fact part of the same one. So you don't necessarily get the links that you might have thought would be automatic ones.
Yet Bell Labs had good connection with a great deal of the electronics industry and electrical industry, and with MIT, and I think with Harvard, at least earlier, not by 1930.
I think if A knows B and B knows C and C knows D, that doesn't in any way mean that A knows D.
That says something about today, doesn't it?
Yes. So you were asking about things to do with the war. There was obviously quite considerable rivalry, which is starting to become a bit clearer rivalry between the big organizations like MIT and so on, and the upstart of the Moore School. Equally, that was a period of time when the whole issue of contract research at universities was requiring to be sorted out. I think the role of Vannevar Bush's organization in this probably needs a lot more bringing out. And this is really talking about the story in the States. The
OSRD.
Yeah, and then it changed its name to NDRC, wasn't it? So there are things there which are probably not fully understood. But basically, there was a lot of pressure, there was a lot of money, and there was a lot of commitment. And people were willing to work incredibly hard and do things of a quality and a speed that just wasn't feasible except with that in an environment with that degree of commitment. The speed with which the Colossus was built is really quite incredible compared to what was done a few years later. And people were willing to work all hours of the day and night, literally, to see their families for about half a day a week, that sort of thing. So the common factor of what was going on in World War II was World War II, I think. That would be my view. And you can speculate as to why various individuals or various companies that in retrospect had the possibility hadn't thought it worth pushing it. Several of the American companies who were involved in things like calculators and office machines and so on had, before the war, started to do research, rather somewhat low-key research, on electronic calculation. As I think probably at least 3 companies had started taking out patents in the general area of electronic digital calculation. But there's a question of when something like that is ripe to be turned into a commercial project, a commercial product.
And that's the key.
Okay.
Should we attempt to structure some of these sessions with lessons in mind, or just let people
Well,
judge?
if you're talking about the taping sessions,
yeah,
it seems to me that it's certainly the more you know beforehand about somebody, who they are and where they were and what they did, the more you've been able to dream up a questionnaire, which is not only which is in and of itself is reasonably well organized, then the more you can get out of an interview.
And you think we should actually have a list of questions to structure? That's an interesting way of doing it.
I think so, because and I think you'll find that the list of questions can include some very standard ones, and can then become more specific, depending on what sort of things they did. Incidentally, everybody who testified in the ENIAC patent suit was led through a quite detailed set of questions at the beginning of their testimony, which effectively asked them to give their curriculum vitae, their resume, in great detail.
So you can get a background for all.
So you get a lot of background there.
Because that's standard legal procedure.
It's standard legal procedure, but it's very effective. And it may well be that in some of the other sort of relevant court cases, you would find the same thing.
That's an old trick that I learned when I was doing different kinds of history that most historians still haven't figured out, is that the material in the law books, the reporters, are a good index to the stuff that's buried. Makes marvelous history. If you want to write detective stories, you don't have to make anything up at all. Just go to the criminal, the British, because they're all in the American libraries too, the British court reporters, and you get some really gory stories. Some of them are too true. So but yes, we could do that.
That's
I've
from
been
a
trying
point
to
of
encourage Gwen to collect as much of that, because she feels that the Digital Museum's goal is not paper, that's the Babbage Institute. But they're here and they're there. I'd rather.
As I say, it depends what you want the tapes for. I was just doing the tapes as the easiest way I could think of getting as much of, so to speak, a brain dump from the people that I was talking to. So I was just anxious not to have a rambling, entertaining chat, but to have it as information full as possible. So that was motivating me. Now, if you listen to the tapes that Chris Evans did, I'm sure he must have done a fair bit of his homework before he actually went to interview people. And he obviously had a lot of experience in interviewing people. And in his case, I would guess that since he was producing those tapes for publication, then organizing his thoughts before he interviewed anybody and then severely editing afterwards was a very important thing to do. Now, those are his and my tapes are very, very different for different purposes.
His tapes were for publication.
Yes.
Not the transcripts.
Sorry, I don't know whether he transcribed these things.
Okay, well, my goal is to have material that can be viewed. It can have to be edited.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised if the standard Hollywood ratio of 10 to 1 is any different for this. Maybe some historians will say, I want to see the whole thing, and then fall asleep halfway through. But let's say what we did today, well, maybe you have 2 hours. If we can get 20 minutes out of this, cut, for somebody to see in the future, see you talking, to see how you follow through the story, to get some other inklings. Of course, with McElroy and the historical people, you want to see some more. I doubt whether the entire thing will be looked at, but some of it will be.
Yeah.
Second goal is that the material being discussed can be transcribed, again, edited, shortened. There's nothing like print for explaining a technical point. Even if you say it, it looks better in print. So you need both.
Yeah.
And the third is if some of this can be made interesting enough to a so-called general audience, interested at least in either history, computers, or management philosophy of science and industry, which is what we're talking about now. What are the lessons to be learned? There's all these what-ifs. Did we have to have a war to produce something we needed for civilian goods? What if Turing's background would have forbidden him from working on cryptography? What would have happened? Nothing?
Good question.
That's why
history is all full of what ifs, isn't it? And who can tell? It seems to me that there are so many places where history could have taken a different turn, and it's very difficult to consider what even the first turn would have led to, leave alone the subsequent turns after that.
Were there a few things in this history that did happen simultaneously, so you get the feeling that it was going to happen anyway? Somebody of these 3 or 5 or 2 individuals would have figured it out. And were there a few things that just could have been delayed or gone a totally different way, except that ABC ran into each other on Tuesday morning?
Well, certainly there you can see quite a deal of parallelism between what Konrad Zuse was doing in Germany and what was being done outside Germany. And one of the most obvious what-ifs is what would have happened if World War II had gone the other way. Then very clearly, it seems to me, Konrad Zuse would have started the world's computer industry rather than people such as Eckert and Mauchly. The stage that he got to, the understanding he got of computers and their significance, even the plans for investing in electronics were all such that if he had got the support, then he would have done it. And in fact, he did reasonably well after the war, despite incredible impediments. So that's one of the most obvious cases of parallelism. There is the more overt parallelism of immediately after the war. By about 1947, say, a number of organizations, I think, were consciously in the race to build a machine. And there was quite an element of a fairly friendly competition. And it was competition particularly within America and within Britain and between the two. If you read the papers from that period, then you'll find that. But by that time, there was enough in the way of diffusion of knowledge that it gets rather difficult to to track down who knew what and so on. And the more interesting and more difficult period to understand is, say, from 1935 or so to 1945.
What about before 1935? Was the Depression a problem?
Well, I mentioned 1935 because of thinking of one or two things that started about then. Before 1935, well, let's think back. Before 1935, there was a lot of commercial activity in, say, the realms of calculating machines and punch card equipment and so on.
That's the point we were making earlier.
Yeah.
Is that the digital computer initially, right after the war, was either scientific or military purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Scientific is a broad range, but still. Yet the impetus before the war that we know about, because there may have been some other secret things, we probably, except for cryptology, I can't imagine anything else that would have been kept secret at this point, was for replacement of tab card machines, which is what happened.
Well, calculating machines as well. There were large numbers of companies making calculating machines of various types. Some of them intended just for business, and others for sort of scientific and engineering purposes. But at least one important figure, Comrie in Britain, who's really quite important in the history of computing, his attitude before the war was that you shouldn't spend time, money and effort trying to build a special machine, which perhaps could be a more automatic machine. Instead, he made a great virtue, a very successful virtue, out of exploring the potential of commercially available equipment. He was saying the commercially available equipment would be reliable, it would be cheap, there would be lots of it, and he found out how to use a whole succession of machines. And there's a marvelous set of papers from him on how to make mathematical tables using first, say, the Brunsviga, then other machines, and eventually things like accounting machines and punch card equipment and so on. So there was that sort of attitude as to what was commercially feasible. He was perhaps one of the leading people with sophisticated numerical calculations to do, and he was working in an economic environment where the notion of putting a lot of effort into building a machine just for those sort of calculations didn't make sense. So that's another aspect of it.
Would it make sense for us to get into concepts of artificial intelligence or machine intelligence at this particular point, considering that Turing did discuss that, I guess as early as 1936? Did he ever discuss that earlier?
I don't know that it was quite that early. He certainly was discussing those sort of ideas at Bletchley Park.
That he was. But I thought
he was discussing it, as far as I can make out, with some of the young Turks, so to speak, rather than the...
This is at Bletchley?
At Bletchley. So this is the comment from
Donald
McGee.
Before he joined the Foreign Office, when he was at Princeton, perhaps? Maybe I may have been thinking of something else.
Not that I can
But that's
recall.
not the earliest thinking about artificial
certainly
intelligence.
you can think of computers, you can place the advent of the computer in the history of, shall we say, robotics. What I chose to do in my book was, I needed to say what were the precursors to computers, and what I chose to concentrate on were essentially calculating machines and sequence control mechanisms. And sequence control mechanisms seem to me to be the logical essence.
What lessons can we get from all this?
Phew. I guess I don't know. It seems to me that an awful lot of the things that are said about the impact of computers are really either rather obvious or rather dubious. Finding something useful to say that isn't one or the other is exceedingly tricky. What should we do now? This is serious. What should we do now?
panel sessions. How should I structure them?
Okay.
Otherwise, it becomes a lot of interesting stories, and so what?
Right.
Well,
I tend. If you're thinking about the panel sessions as, well, depends how you view the panel sessions. If you view them as, if you see them as something that is to be viewed by people, perhaps edited, then that's one thing. Or if you just view them as a means of getting more information because having several people together will cause more things to be remembered and brought out. If you take that first one, then seeing them as viewable, my own guess there is that just making them viewable is going to be difficult in the sense that you are really going to want to introduce those various characters who form the panel session. And you either do that by means of something separate that you then splice into the panel session. So the panel session really becomes, as it often is, just the final part of a program. But, there's, in a certain sense, almost being the meat of the program, and then the final panel session where you have the final discussion which draws things together. You're obviously disagreeing with me.
No. I'm just thinking about that because it's a novel way of doing it both ways.
Or alternatively, if you are having a set of people there when you have to spend a long time talking just one, then the other, then that seems a bit silly.
No, you want to have the interaction.
But as I say, you've got to do quite a bit in the way of introduction, particularly if you're thinking of this as producing a movie, producing a film that the average man in the computer street is going to look at.
That's if we think that way,
yes.
Which is not necessarily the way we're going, but there's
fine.
an idea there. It's always better to plan a production than to try to grab it. But I like the point you make of introducing the people and the concepts, perhaps individually in separate little sessions. That could be done before they all sit down that morning. We can interview each one of them about themselves.
If you can, now this starts making more of a production of it, but the way, for example, the BBC introduced Tommy Flowers was by interviewing him as he looked around the old Dollis Hill research labs. Now,
they followed him around with a crew.
And so to speak, introducing having somebody in an appropriate background so that he can be talking, but so that the background itself is of interest.
I was going to try to do that today, but it's very hard to talk to somebody and follow them around with a camera.
Yeah. Well, the notion of whether you're following them around a lot is almost unimportant. But let's say you've got 5 people on a panel session, and you end up with 6 segments of the program, all filmed in the same studio against the same curtain or whatever.
That's dull.
That's dull.
That's what we did last time.
Yes. If you even do it so that the 5 people are each interviewed in their own home or in their own study or something, that's already better. If you can go further than that, each is interviewed in the computer room where they work or something.
Or in front of a piece of ENIAC or Whirlwind.
Okay.
So how much of that can we get? Colossus we can't put together. Are there any pieces around, you think? Or they really did dismantle it?
There are tiny little bits.
They really did dismantle it.
There are tiny little bits that have escaped captivity. As to whether there's anything more in captivity, I have no idea. I think in some cases there, you're not going to do it with Tommy Flowers. I'm sure he won't come over to the States again. But
we're going over to England.
No. Well, what I was thinking of was that where the machine doesn't exist, if it's already featured in a museum, then you could interview somebody in front of the museum display.
Well, we have the collections at Smithsonian and at Marlborough. And Science Museum.
Yeah, so no, that seems to be one of the ways of dealing with it.
Are there any other places that we should think about? Nothing at Penn.
If you take...
we could go to Bletchley.
Yeah. If you start doing this, I think you'll find yourself redoing what the BBC was doing. I mean, it may be the easier way is just to grab some of their film.
But that's for the stuff they did do, but there's a lot they didn't do.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Right.
But it seemed, I don't think you'd get very much out of actually going to Bletchley any more than you would have got just by grabbing a bit of their film of going to Bletchley.
We could have that in the background. Aiken machine is half at Smithsonian and half at Harvard.
Yeah.
And Whirlwind, there's pieces around, because MIT has plenty of background.
Yeah. So, so as I say, if you think of the panel session as the culmination of something, then that puts in a very different perspective to how to organize the panel session. You still need to organize the panel session.
Yes,
but,
that's what I want to do.
That's the question I have. Okay. All right, so if you get into the panel session at the point where essentially the individuals have all been introduced and talked to and so on, and it's now a question, it seems to me that the panel session is purely concerned with their reactions to each other and their joint discussion of some points of interest. Okay, that starts to seem to me the obvious way the panel sessions are used, at least in BBC programs. And so such things as some of the questions you're asking me, asking them such questions as what would have happened to the computers if World War II hadn't happened? That category, I think. Or
how did it change thinking?
Yeah.
Was it just the money? Was it the idea of thinking the way you think about a computer, digitally, binary numbers, more complex ways of counting, breaking up tasks into subtasks? Though you had linear programming before, but it wasn't really applied much to engineering. Something bothers me. That red light is not on.
Okay, so there's that sort of question. And some of those questions are obviously ones you could have dealt with individually, but that may be more interesting if a group of people talk amongst themselves about it. Right? I guess the other sort of questions are to do with their reactions to each other and their interactions and so on.
And there's an interesting thing about that with regards to cryptology. Yeah. Again, it's the thing that rides all of this. They kept it segmented and secret.
Yeah.
If their goal was to develop machines for breaking codes, could they have not done that a lot faster and easier if the actual technology was open? So the goals could have been secret. Instead of breaking it up into little segments.
Oh, well, it wasn't broken up that finely, at least at Bletchley.
Not at Bletchley, but it surely was here.
That I don't know.
It seems that people who were working on computers for one purpose had no idea anybody else was working on machines.
Oh, okay. The Bletchley people, well, my report tries to summarize what they knew beforehand, what they knew during, and what they knew after, and so on. Certainly, I think the Bletchley people were fully aware of all the technology things which were going on at Bletchley, which seemed to be directly relevant to them.
Luckily, it was all happening at Bletchley. There was no other center. In the United States, there was at least 4 centers, and some of it surely had nothing to do with cryptology. I gather this was understood well enough for things like ERA to be formed, even as a front organization, so they could send the people to the meetings. See, that's an admission that secrecy doesn't really work.
Okay.
And then, of course, the statement that NSA made during the 50s, where they deliberately funded public research, feeling that would give them the maximum gain. And that, of course, brings us to a major policy issue today, where the reverse is taking place. The feeling that this kind of research should be done secretly and controlled. Yet, all their gains, it appears, up till now, even according to some of the stuff Welchman said in his book, where nothing new has happened in 20 years, has been because they took from the public sphere.
This gets into areas, particularly when you're starting to talk about cryptography rather than computing, where I guess I just don't know what the truth is, and I wouldn't in any case feel I got any expertise to apply on evaluating the truth.
But does anyone?
No, I have no idea.
See, but that's a policy issue. We've seen the same thing in the civilian era, where American corporations do not cooperate with each other because it's illegal. Also, they're very competitive. The Japanese corporations cooperate with each other, except the plugs don't fit. But they've dominated. 100% of the American video market comes from Japan. It's not like they have a piece of it. And they didn't invent television. I don't know how true it is in Europe. Is it the same thing happening?
As far as I know. Well, I don't know. There's still a lot of strength with Philips on consumer electronics.
We have nothing here. RCA's all made in Japan. They just put their name on it. That's Panasonic. There's where the crux of government policy comes in. They have encouraged just the reverse of what brought most of the Western world to technological superiority in the last, I don't know, we can't put a time on a decade, or maybe it is this feeling where we don't tell anybody what we're doing, and we're not going anywhere.
I was in Japan last October, and while we were there, one of the English language Japanese newspapers was talking about video area, how they had successfully penetrated the West by doing it essentially on the quiet via existing Western organizations, rather than with the much more obvious way that they had attacked the automobile industry.
Which was innovation.
Well, no, they were doing it openly. They were selling Japanese cars, as opposed to providing machines to Ford to sell. Now, that's starting to happen.
I see. Yeah, here they do it through Western trading corporations. They look very American, too. Yeah. Though that's another item of contention. Been talking to the older people at MIT who worked in the radiation lab during World War II. They often fall back on something that I hope to capture on tape. They said the spirit was different during the war. We cooperated with people that you wouldn't dream of cooperating with today, or even before the war. They saw RCA and Bell Labs giving each other marketing secrets without even questioning it. The Justice Department, of course, didn't question it. They could have. The wartime did not suspend the antitrust laws. It has to be done in a deliberate act. Justice Department went through that. MIT encouraged other centers of learning to get government grants.
Though,
that type of thing.
As I say, there's a fair story to be told about the MIT, the relationship between some of the big organizations like MIT and the Moore School.
Yes, okay. So that was an exception. That's true. Moore School wasn't funded by OSRD.
Well, the ENIAC people felt, and I believe they got reason to feel, that they were barely being tolerated by the MITs and like they were regarded as upstarts, and that they got their money despite the advice that the government was getting from MIT and so on. Now, it only requires the odd individual or so to do something that sets up that sort of feeling. But certainly I've seen letters and so on that make it quite reasonable for the Moore School people to have had that attitude.
That followed after the war, too. But that didn't help any, though.
No.
ENIAC could have been more of a contribution. I don't see there was any coordination of digital computing activities during the war. Do you see any evidence of that?
Well, certainly there was a bit of borrowing back and forth of technology, and I think in general people were told about what else was going on.
But no coordination.
Probably no coordination. Well, I don't know, depends what you mean by coordination.
No research directorate saying you do this, you do that, or he's doing that. Don't concentrate on it.
Well, I think in some senses there were people who knew that, and despite such knowledge, said, "Well, it's still worth doing this." That some people were. There are arguments by Caldwell and others that because of what was already being done elsewhere, it wasn't worth doing ENIAC. And if you like, that was an attempted act of coordination. Okay.
Would that have been successful? Suppose they stopped ENIAC. Would we have gotten as far as we did by early post-war era? It's an opinion, of course, but could we find some evidence for one way or the other?
My own guess is probably not. That ENIAC demonstrated very publicly the viability of using large numbers of electronic tubes, and just as Colossus had done on a smaller scale, but privately. Colossus, I think, had an effect within Britain, but a rather limited effect, whereas ENIAC, that brought giant electronic brain onto the front pages and things like that.
Now, if we didn't have ENIAC, there's a lot of what-if questions, but sometimes they they make sense, follow a line of reasoning. Would the British government had to reveal Colossus earlier, or at all, or was it sufficient that a handful of people knew that it could be done and simply replicated again after the war with a more specific purpose in mind?
Okay. I doubt very much.
Turing need ENIAC.
Yes, okay. Turing need ENIAC. That's a very good question. I doubt if Turing needed it. Turing was an immensely self-sufficient individual. One of his major characteristics was his wish to start everything from scratch. And I don't think, and I think Turing got his support, his governmental support, at least in part based on his achievements in the Bletchley Park work and so on. However, that might have got that particular one, Turing and NPL going. But the other ones, the Manchester and particularly Cambridge and so on, almost certainly not. Certainly Cambridge not. And it was quite a big step still from an electronic machine for breaking codes to some sort of general purpose machine that could be used for calculations and all sorts of things.
It sounds like the Americans needed ENIAC.
Mm-hmm.
That it wouldn't have been sufficient for the grapevine to have told them there was a machine in Britain to get it funded.
I think the number of people in America who would have had any knowledge of Colossus and who could have had any influence would have been, well, probably zero. I think that it's also not just a question of the government doing things, but of people believing that it's necessary. That it's necessary, that it's a good idea, that it's worth doing, and so on. And at the end of the war, there were quite a large number of people who'd been trained in electronics, the radar, and so on. And one of the questions was, what should they do next? Well, the idea of the computer had come up and had become well known.
But very few of them worked on a computer for a long time. There wasn't much being done with computers for another 5 years that employed many people. You had ENIAC and then EDVAC. And von Neumann didn't get his project started till when?
46.
When did he get money, though? Wasn't that much later? Because he didn't finish until 51.
Well, take the case of Britain. The sort of state that Britain was in after the war is something that's very difficult to understand now. In economic terms, you might say that Britain lost the war as much as Germany did. The miracle is what was achieved in the first few years after the war.
That's an important area for us to see. We could have an afternoon on that, on the meaning of this to the immediate post-war British electronics industry or computer industry. I always felt ICL was ahead for a few years.
ICL after the war. Well, ICL is a conglomerate. And you have to go back into its various roots. Immediately after the war, very shortly after the war, there was this effort to bring various companies into contact with the various computer developments. English Electric was involved with NPL. Ferranti was involved with Manchester. British Tabulating Machine, as it was called, was involved with the Birkbeck College people. So there were those sorts of links. And certainly there was some attempt of government funding to encourage that sort of thing to happen. But all of that soon turned out to be very small beer indeed compared to the American commercial might.
But that didn't happen until about...
Oh no, by that time you're getting to about 1950s.
Yes, then IBM...
But even by then, if you looked at the number of projects that were going on in the States, there must have been dozens of projects involving various sorts of institutions and universities and companies and so on. Perhaps in the case of companies, a number you've never heard of again. Libroscope and General Precision and so just the general scale and the general economic power that was available in the States. I mean, that was bound to start having that effect. But certainly, the impression I have is that quite a few of the top people from Malvern went off into computer-type projects at Manchester or the Ministry of Supply and things like that. But another thing, of course, is that a lot of the people stopped doing what they were doing during the war because they had done it for the war. They had they didn't regard that as their real work, so to speak. And that's obvious in the case of the cryptanalysts. They went back to their mathematics or whatever. And I could well imagine that quite a number of people who were doing radar would say go back to the Cavendish, to go back to their physics research and so on. So there was a dispersion like that.
And that'd be worth following some of these people, why they made certain decisions. Well, this gets into the second one, the development of, or the third one, the development of computing as a business. And that transition from 45 to 50, which is fairly critical to understand, even if it's loose, because it's so very, very relevant to what we're doing today with microcomputers and new industries. During the latter phases of the war in this country, go back to an earlier incarnation of careers, you'd be an urban planner. The planners, the economic planners of the New Deal, those involved in social planning, felt the Depression was going to return. They found it very hard to conceive the concept of a new industry of any kind saving them from an economic depression. They saw most of the industries they were dealing with as mature and dying. They couldn't conceive of suburbanization and the automobile expanding, which was not a novel industry, just selling more cars. But even that was beyond their ken. But surely something like computers, television, they didn't take seriously. They didn't see that employing anybody. The manufacturing aspects was trivial. It was hard to see how anything could have come out of World War II that could be used for civilian purposes, except to have a military industrial. That word didn't come until 15 years later, but to continue militarization, and that too was rejected. So they saw disarmament as return to depression, and they made plans for furthering of a depression-type mentality of a welfare state. And they were, those who were concerned about politics were worried whether democracy could continue, because it wasn't doing too well for the first 8 years of the Depression. The war did end the Depression. There was a slight slump after the war.
And then the Korean War had a pretty good effect again, too.
You know, but even militarizing for the Korean War didn't begin until about 48 or so. There was that 3 years after the war where the military just, if they were going to continue arming, they saw it in terms of very conventional arms. So the argument to build a nuclear arm is awfully expensive. What good are they? Jet bombers, what good are they? Rocketry was dismissed for 10 years, which is why the Russians got ahead of us. And what I've been looking towards in the area of computation, that was a tough area to get funded. It just, until SAGE, until the ground environment, it was...
Eckert and Mauchly, right from a very early time, had decided that computers were for business. And
I mean, funded by the military.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
No, but they were trying to sell their UNIVACs from the very early times to business as much as anything else.
But that was about 47. 48. When did they form the Eckert and Mauchly computing company?
I think they were starting to do that with it. Okay, I'd have to guess that it was 45 or perhaps 46 when they had that vision.
Well, they were one of the few people who see it as a business.
They were different, certainly. They were different in the States. In Britain, the only equivalence is that amazing episode of Lions, Neo Computer.
Yeah, the department store.
It
was also American Totalizer in the United States, which I've got to explore further, because that was a obvious business. I don't know about cryptology. I don't know how much. The NSA was formed in 1947 or 8, I think, or it was 49. The CIA in 1947. I don't know how much they put into computing. They may, for all we know, have carried it for those number of years. Maybe von Neumann could have seen that as a possible source of funds, perhaps MIT. Don't know about that, but I did look at the Air Force, and they rejected the technology. It was the Air Force that finally got the military into modern technology, but they were a new organization in 1946. There was no Air Force during the war. It was part of the Army. I think the same was true in Britain. No? That the Royal Air Force was separate from the Army?
Oh, yeah.
Churchill, in his memoirs, says that he started pushing for post-war air defense based on radar as early as 1944. He saw the Soviets as a threat. Roosevelt did not see them as a threat.
Right.
The Air Force did not see them. Right, did not see them as a threat. There's a whole book on this, on how the Air Force generals had to be turned around, had to get rid of most of the general staff before they started saying technology might help. Now, it's a whole other question of whether this was good or bad from the point of view of peace. And nevertheless, it happened that way. And then, late 40s, they began to put money in it. And then we have the videotape recordings of how Project Charles got started at MIT, which led to SAGE and Whirlwind. back, the Navy had rejected. There's another example. The Navy didn't want to fund Whirlwind anymore. They thought that was a waste of money. And Forrester was lucky to find salvation in the Air Force.
That's an exceedingly interesting project, Whirlwind, from the point of view of its financing, its direction. And,
Well, that's section 3. How did business get involved? How did it get financed? But the policy issue is just, it's obvious because we have the same thing today. There are people who say that we're running into another worldwide depression. And there are others who claim that new technologies will save us. There's a transition time. The transition time after World War II was only 4 or 5 years. There was not much unemployment. It could have been worse. And then the new technologies, the old technologies, the automobile, and which 25% of our economy for years. And then television, electronics, and appliances, and home building, and suburbia, and all that just carried the boom, plus the wartime. But if you look at military spending, it wasn't that big. R&D was big. And that contributed something to the video. Surely by the time the space age came, which was 10 years away. But those in charge of economic planning and social planning did not have that vision in 1945. If you left it up to them, they would have created a second depression. If you said you have to fund these projects, they were rejecting them.
That's the difference between the West and Russia, where, to what extent...
I'm being very didactic about
I know.
it.
But to what extent were there people in the West who were not just sort of planning, but causing those plans to come to reality?
Those weren't the planners. Fortunately, in this country, the planners had no power. They had lost all their power because of various complex reasons. We had a national planning, I forgot the name, National Resources Planning Council or something like that, which was abolished during World War II, just when, and most rational people would have made the argument, you should not get rid of it because we have to do something about post-war. That was abolished. In a way, that was fortunate because those people would have really fouled things up. They had no vision. Why had they no vision? Because they didn't know enough about technology? Because they didn't have enough faith? I don't know. Are we going through the same problem today? We're sitting on the edge of a technological revolution, which maybe I'm wrong, maybe we're all wrong. Maybe it's going to automate everything, we're going to have a depression. But you could have said the same thing then. And we now have Reaganomics means don't fund R&D. It's going to make it harder to do certain things. Who funded the computer revolution?
There's a recent book, The Computer Establishment. I don't know how much of this sort of thing is sorted out by that. Equally, I've been told it's good. Equally, there's the book by Brock on the U.S. computer industry.
That's a few years old.
Yeah, that's a few, but I found that quite impressive. Those would be the places that that I would go look at those sort of questions.
It seems that the second generation was funded by the government, both military and civilian needs. The first generation that we want to explore, was it government? Was it Bell looking for a machine to do accounting? And the banks looking for machines to do accounting? There's a thesis to that effect that the reason we got ahead of the Russians is we had to make our bureaucracy more efficient while the Russians have no incentive to do that. Our bureaucracy being banks and department stores and the telephone company.
You probably learned something from the biography of Hollerith, which has just come out, the one by Austria.
Yes.
Which I certainly very much liked.
I
don't know what size IBM had by the end of the war. But
the tab card industry, they had enough to be being sued by Sperry. Remington for.
I don't mean relative size. I mean absolute size.
That's an interesting question. How important was tabulating to business?
I guess to big business it become fairly important, and it become fairly important to the government as well. The government would use not so much the census. The government, U.S. government used punch card equipment on just so as to be able to fight the war in a certain sense, or at least.
And also for social statistics during the Depression.
So there was so much on a growth there. Once they got involved with computers, once they bit the bullet, so to speak, when T.J. Watson Jr. Almost elbowed his father away and got IBM into it.
And that was 1950.
So there was that sort of thing.
But it was unplanned. There's no question about that.
That's right.
Can we plan the future?